there is a particular kind of man that the warrior culture of medieval Japan produced in large numbers and celebrated without reservation, and that the same warrior culture, in its more reflective moments, also recognized as a kind of tragedy, the man who is very good at violence, not good at it in the way that a professional soldier in a modern army is good at it, trained in specific techniques, for specific situations, following rules of engagement, developed by institutions, over long periods of careful thought, good at it in the older sense, the natural sense, the sense in which a hawk is good at hunting, in which the capacity is not learned, but constitutive, not something added to the person, but something the person is made of. Kumagai Naozane was that kind of man. He was born in the province of Musashi in the eastern part of Japan, that the Heike chronicles call the land of the warrior clans, the territory that had been producing fighters of exactly his type for several generations. The year of his birth is given as 1141, which places him in the middle years of the late Heian period in the decades before the Great War. That would end the Heian world and replace it with something harder and simpler and less beautiful, and in some ways more honest. He was born into a minor warrior family, not the great clans, not the Minamoto or the Taira themselves, whose names and rivalries would eventually consume everything. He was born into one of the hundreds of smaller families that clustered around the great clans, like planets around a sun, families that owed loyalty upward and received protection in return, families whose men trained for war, because war was the family business, because the alternative to being useful in battle was not being useful at all. The Musashi Plain is a broad, flat territory, west of what is now Tokyo. In the 12th century, it was a landscape of rice paddies and pine forests, of river crossings and narrow roads, of small settlements centered on the compounds, of local warrior families who had been managing this territory for their various lords for as long as anyone could remember. It was not a refined landscape. It was not the landscape of the Heian capital with its gardens and temples, and the accumulated aesthetic weight of 4 centuries of imperial civilization. It was a working landscape, a landscape organized around the practical requirements of agriculture and warfare, and the movement of goods and people through the flat country, between the mountains to the west and the sea to the east. The men who grew up in this landscape grew up knowing certain things. They knew how to ride, they knew how to shoot from horseback, the particular discipline of the mounted archer. That was the central skill of the Eastern warrior tradition, the ability to draw and release, while moving at speed, over broken ground. They knew how to fight with a sword, at close quarters, in the spaces where horses could not go, in the moments after the arrows were spent, and the distance between enemies had closed to nothing, and they knew something less technical, but equally important. They knew what fighting was for. In the warrior culture of Eastern Japan, fighting was not a last resort. It was not the failure of diplomacy or the breakdown of negotiation. It was the primary mechanism by which the world was organized, the means by which disputes were settled, boundaries confirmed, loyalties tested, and the relative positions of men and families in the social order established and maintained. A man who could not fight was not a man, in the sense that mattered in this world. A man who would not fight was something worse, and a man who could fight, and did fight, and fought well, was the kind of man that this world valued above all others, the kind of man whose name was spoken with a particular quality of respect, the kind of man whose sons would be pointed to when people wanted to explain what a warrior was supposed to be. Naozane understood all of this, before he was old enough to articulate it. He absorbed it the way children absorb, the fundamental assumptions of the world they grow up in, without choosing to, without being able to refuse. He became what his world required him to become. He became very good at violence. The specific details of his early career are not fully preserved. The chronicles of the Genpei War, the great conflict between the Minamoto and the Taira that would eventually consume his life, are focused primarily on the great families, and the great battles on the strategic movements of the principal commanders, and the political decisions that shaped the course of the war. Minor warriors from Musashi appear in these records when they do something notable enough to be worth recording, and they disappear from them when the notable moment is over. Naozane appears in the records because he did something notable. What he did before that moment is reconstructed from fragments from the genealogical records of the warrior families, from the scattered references in the chronicles to his presence at various engagements. What the fragments suggest is a man who had been fighting for most of his adult life, who had accumulated the experience and the reputation that the Eastern warrior world rewarded with status and position, who had sons of his own by the time the Great War began, sons who were old enough to fight alongside him. He was in his early 40s when the war that would change everything began. He was already, by the standards of his world, an old warrior. He had been doing this for 20 years. He was very good at it. He had never, as far as the records suggest, had cause to question it. The Eastern warrior tradition had its own ethics, not the elaborate philosophical ethics of the later samurai tradition, the Bushido that would be codified and systematized and written down in the centuries after the Genpei War. Something rawer than that, something older, the ethics of the man who has decided that loyalty is the organizing principle of his life, loyalty upward to the Lord, loyalty sideways to the companions in arms, loyalty to the cause that the Lord represents, whatever that cause happens to be. In this ethical framework, the question is never whether to fight. The question is always only whom to fight for, and whether that Lord deserves the loyalty that the warrior has committed to giving. Naozane had answered this question. He had answered it in the way that warriors of his generation answered it, by attaching himself to the Minamoto cause, to the family that had been driven from power by the Taira, and that was now, under Yoritomo's leadership, gathering strength in the east to take it back. The cause was legitimate. The Lord was worthy. The war was just. This was what he believed. This was what his world had given him to believe. He rode west when the war came. He was ready. To understand why Naozane rode west, you have to understand what had happened to Japan in the decades before he was born, and what was happening to it in the years of his early adulthood, and why the men of the eastern provinces looked at those events and made the choices they made. Japan in the middle of the 12th century was a country in the process of discovering something about itself. It was discovering that the political arrangements that had governed it for 300 years were no longer adequate for the pressures that were building inside them. The Heian political system had been built on a particular assumption. The assumption was that power could be organized ceremonially, that the imperial court, with its elaborate hierarchy and its careful distribution of ranks and titles, and its insistence on the priority of aesthetic refinement over military capability, could maintain order across a country as large and as varied as Japan. For 3 centuries this had worked, not perfectly. There had always been disorder in the provinces, always been local conflicts that required the attention of warrior families hired by the court, to manage the messier aspects of governance. But the system had held. The center had remained the center. The emperor and his court had remained, at least symbolically, the source of authority, from which all other authority derived. What broke the system was not any single event, but the accumulation of several developments that reinforced each other. Over the course of a century, the warrior families grew stronger. This was partly a consequence of the court's own policies, which had tasked these families with managing the provinces, and had given them, in the process, the local knowledge and the local connections, and the local resources that made them progressively less dependent on the center they were supposed to serve. The imperial family grew weaker, not militarily weak because the imperial family had never been militarily strong, but politically weak in the sense that the internal disputes that periodically erupted over succession and the division of power between the reigning emperor and the retired emperor created openings for the warrior families to play one faction against another and accumulate influence that they had not previously had. And the two great warrior families, the Minamoto and the Taira, grew into the space that these developments opened. The Minamoto were the family of the East. Their power base was in the provinces of Musashi and Sagami and the other territories of the Kanto Plain, the broad flat country east of the mountains, where Naozane had grown up, where the warrior tradition was oldest and deepest, and most completely itself. The Minamoto had been great before. They had produced generals of genius, men whose military campaigns in the northern and eastern provinces had extended imperial authority into territories that had previously been outside its reach. But the Minamoto had also suffered. They had been defeated a generation before the war in a conflict with the Taira that had left their principal family decimated and their surviving members scattered across the eastern provinces. Yoritomo was the heir of this defeated family. He had been exiled as a child. After his father's defeat, he had grown up in the province of Izu, on the peninsula south of what is now Shizuoka, under the surveillance of the Taira administration. He had spent 20 years in exile. He had used the time to cultivate relationships with the warrior families of the East to build a network of loyalties that would become the foundation of everything he subsequently built. When the call came in 1180, when the imperial prince's message called on the warriors of Japan to destroy the Taira, Yoritomo moved. He moved carefully, which was characteristic of him. He was not a reckless man. He was not a man who confused courage with the absence of calculation. He raised his banner. In the province of Izu, he called the warrior families of the East to join him. Some refused. The Taira were still powerful. The risks were still enormous. A failed rebellion was not simply a military defeat. It was death and confiscation and the destruction of everything the warrior family had built over generations. But enough came. Enough of the warrior families of the Kanto had decided by 1180 that Yoritomo's cause was worth the enormous risk it represented, that the resentment of 2 decades of Taira dominance was sufficient motivation to put everything at stake. Naozane was among those who came. The specific circumstances of his decision are not recorded in the way that the decisions of major commanders are recorded. He was not a major commander. He was one of the hundreds of Eastern warriors who attached themselves to the growing Minamoto force in the months after Yoritomo raised his banner. But the decision itself had a logic that is not difficult to reconstruct. He was a Minamoto retainer. His family owed its position and its lands to the Minamoto connection, to the generations of service. That had bound his family to this family. When the Minamoto called, men like Naozane came. This was what the loyalty meant. This was what it had always meant. Not loyalty as a feeling, though the feeling was real, but loyalty as a structural commitment, as the organizing principle of the warrior's social existence, as the thing that gave the fighting its meaning and its justification. He rode to Yoritomo's standard. He presented himself. He was received as one of the Eastern warriors, one of the men on whom the Minamoto campaign would depend, and then he waited for the war to come to him. The early months of Yoritomo's campaign were not uniformly successful. There was a battle at Ishibashiyama in the early days of the rebellion, where Yoritomo's forces were surprised and nearly destroyed, where Yoritomo himself barely escaped into the mountains and survived by hiding in a hollow tree. The escape became legendary. The narrowness of it, the fact that the man who would eventually transform Japan had almost been killed in the first weeks of his campaign, gave the subsequent history the quality of something that had almost not happened, of a world that had almost gone differently. But Yoritomo survived, and after Ishibashiyama, the tide turned. The warrior families of the Kanto gathered around his standard, in numbers that surprised even him. The organization that he had been building, in his years of exile, proved more robust than the Taira had estimated. By the end of 1180, Yoritomo had established a base at Kamakura, the small coastal settlement in Sagami province. That would become the center of his new order, and the Minamoto army was large enough that the Taira in the capital began to take the rebellion seriously for the first time. Naozane was part of this army. He trained with it. He rode with it through the maneuvers and the smaller engagements of the first years of the war. He became known among the Eastern warriors as a man of the front ranks, a man who chose the most dangerous positions, not because he had been ordered to, but because that was where his nature took him. He had sons with him. This is mentioned in the records. The detail that will become important later, the fact that Naozane went to war in the company of his own children. This was not unusual. The Eastern warrior families went to war as families, the fathers and the sons, fighting together under the same standard, the younger generation learning the practice by practicing it alongside the men who had made it their lives. Naozane had a son named Kojiro. The boy was young, perhaps 16, perhaps a little older. He was at his father's side. He was learning what his father knew. They rode west together. When the campaign finally moved west, when Yoritomo's generals took the army into the territories where the Taira were waiting, father and son, warrior and apprentice warrior, the old world teaching the new world how to be itself. Yoritomo did not lead his army west himself. This is one of the most important and most underappreciated facts about the Genpei War. The fact that the man who won it almost never fought in it, that the principal architect of the Minamoto victory spent most of the war at Kamakura managing the administrative apparatus of the new order he was building, while his brothers and generals did the actual fighting in the actual battles. This was not cowardice. Yoritomo understood with the kind of clarity that distinguishes great political minds from merely great military ones, that the war was not primarily a military problem. The military problem was real. The Taira were powerful. They had warriors and ships and resources, and the institutional weight of a decade of controlling the imperial court. But the deeper problem was political. The question of what Japan would be after the war, of who would govern it, and by what authority, and through what institutions, was a question that battles could not answer. Battles could only create the conditions in which political questions could be answered. Yoritomo was always thinking about the political questions. His generals were thinking about the battles. The general who commanded the Western campaign in its most decisive phase was Yoritomo's younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune was everything Yoritomo was not. He was a fighter, not a manager of fighters, not a strategist in the political sense, but a man whose genius was operational, whose talent expressed itself in the actual conduct of battle, in the reading of terrain and timing, and the psychology of combat. That separates the great commanders from the merely competent ones. He had grown up in temples. After his father's defeat, his mother had taken him to the temple of Kuramadera, north of Kyoto, where he had been raised, by the monks, who found in him, as he grew, something that temples do not usually produce: a warrior. The legends say he learned to fight from the Tengu, the supernatural beings of the mountain forests, the spirits of the wild places, who taught him the techniques that no human teacher could have given him. The legends are legends. What they encode is something real. Yoshitsune's fighting ability was so far beyond the ordinary that his contemporaries reached for supernatural explanations because the natural ones seemed insufficient. Under Yoshitsune's command, the Minamoto Western campaign moved quickly. He took his forces into the territories that the Taira had retreated to, the western provinces along the inland sea, where the clan had its deepest roots, and he fought the kind of war that the Taira commanders were consistently unable to prepare for. He moved faster than expected. He attacked from directions that seemed impossible. He made decisions in the middle of battles that no commander operating from a purely rational assessment of the situation would have made, and the decisions worked consistently in ways that accumulated into a series of victories that seemed, in retrospect, inevitable, even though at the time of each battle, the outcome had been genuinely uncertain. Naozane rode under Yoshitsune's command. He was one of the warriors. Of the eastern forces, one of the men who had come west with the campaign and who fought in the engagements that Yoshitsune designed. He was good at what Yoshitsune needed. He was aggressive. He chose the front. He pushed forward when forward was the right direction. In the campaigns before Ichinotani, he accumulated the kind of record that the warrior culture valued, the specific incidents of bravery and effective violence that built a reputation, that made a man's name, something that other men recognized. The cause that brought him west was, in his understanding, entirely legitimate. The Minamoto were the rightful power. The Taira had usurped a position that was not theirs by right. The imperial family, properly understood, supported the restoration of the Minamoto to their appropriate role. This is what the cause looked like from the perspective of an Eastern warrior. In the Minamoto army, it was a clean cause, good against bad, right against wrong, the restoration of proper order against the usurpation of an order that had corrupted itself. This kind of clarity is enormously useful in war. It removes the friction of doubt. It makes the violence simple. The man across from you is not a person with a life and a family and a history and a set of reasons for being where he is that are as comprehensible as your own reasons. He is the enemy. He represents what is wrong. Defeating him is what is right. Naozane had this clarity. He had always had it. It was what made him effective. But the war he was riding into had a quality that wars often have, and that the clarity of causes often obscures until it is too late. The quality of proximity. From a distance, the Taira were a clan, an institution, an abstraction, the enemy that the cause required. Up close, they were men, men on horses, men with faces, Men who, when you got close enough, turned out to be approximately the same age as you, or younger, or much younger, and who were fighting with the same desperation and the same skill and the same commitment to their cause that you were bringing to yours. This is a thing that wars do, that the stories told about wars tend to minimize. The closer you get to the enemy, the more the enemy resembles you. Naozane was about to get very close. In the winter of 1184, Yoshitsune's forces approached the Taira positions at Ichinotani. The Taira had established their camp on a narrow coastal strip between the mountains to the north and the sea to the south, a position that was defensible. From the front, from the direction the Minamoto attack was expected, and that was protected from behind by the cliffs of the mountains, which were considered too steep for any serious force to descend. The Taira had made careful preparations. They had built fortifications along the beachside approaches. They had positioned their ships in the waters offshore, giving their warriors an escape route. If the land battle went badly, they were ready for the battle. They expected. They were not ready for Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune divided his force. One portion attacked from the west, from the direction the Taira expected, making the assault that would fix the defenders' attention and commit them to holding the western approaches. The other portion, the smaller portion, the portion that Yoshitsune led himself, went north into the mountains toward the cliffs that the Taira had decided were not a military problem. Naozane was in the main force, the force attacking from the west. His part of the battle was the part that was supposed to be difficult, the frontal assault, against prepared defenses, the advance into the fortifications that the Taira had built to stop exactly this kind of attack. He did what he was good at. He pushed forward. The Battle of Ichinotani was fought in the first month of 1184. It did not go as the Taira had planned. Yoshitsune's descent from the cliffs, which the chronicles describe, with a quality of stunned disbelief, struck the Taira position from behind at the same moment that the frontal assault was pressing them from the front. The fortifications that had been built to stop an attack from the sea were useless against an attack from the mountains. The camp was chaos. Warriors who had been at their positions suddenly had to turn to face a threat from the direction they had been confident could not produce one. The Taira lines broke. They ran for the ships. This is the moment that everything converges on, the moment when the battle became a rout, and the rout became a chaos of men running for the water, for the boats, for the escape that the sea represented. And it was in this moment, in the chaos of the Taira retreat toward the beach, that Naozane found himself riding after a warrior who was heading for the water. The warrior ahead of him was moving fast. He had almost reached the sea. He was going to make it to the boats. Naozane called to him. He called to him in the way that Eastern warriors were supposed to call to opponents before engaging them, the formal challenge that the warrior tradition required, the declaration of name and lineage that transformed fighting from mere violence into something with meaning. The warrior ahead of him turned around. Before the beach, before the moment of turning, before everything that followed from it, there was the campaign, the weeks and months of movement through unfamiliar country, the western provinces, that Naozane had not seen before, the landscape of the inland sea territories, that was so different from the broad flat country of his eastern home. This is the part of the story that the chronicles compress, that the narrative of the great battle tends to skip over in its urgency to reach the dramatic moment. But the campaign mattered. What happened to Naozane at Ichinotani did not happen to him in isolation. It happened to a man who had been moving through this landscape for months, who had been living inside the war at close range for long enough to have absorbed it in ways he was not entirely aware of. The inland sea coast is beautiful. This is worth saying because it is relevant, because the beauty of the landscape that the war moved through is part of what the Heike chronicles are trying to convey, the tragic irony of the most terrible things happening in the most beautiful places. The mountains of the western provinces come down to the sea in a way that the eastern mountains do not. They are not the gradual descent of the Kanto plain into the flat coastal territory. They arrive at the water directly, the forest running down to where the land ends and the sea begins, the line between them sometimes sharp and sometimes gradual, depending on where you are and what season you are there in. In the winter of 1184, the sea was gray and the mountains were the dark green of winter cedar, and the small settlements along the coast were quiet in the way that places where armies have recently passed are always quiet, the residents having made the calculation that invisibility was the appropriate response to the presence of large numbers of armed men moving through. Naozane moved through this landscape as a soldier moves through landscape with the specific attention to terrain and cover and water sources and defensible positions that military experience instills, and with a corresponding inattention to everything that is not militarily relevant. But landscape seeps in, even when you are not trying to let it, the particular quality of the light on a particular morning, the sound of the sea in the quiet hours before dawn, the way the winter cedars hold the mist in the morning before the sun burns it off. He was in this landscape. He was moving through it toward the battle that was coming. The warriors he was moving with were men he knew, not all of them individually. The army that Yoshitsune had assembled was large enough that no single man could know all of it, but he knew the type. He was the type. The Eastern warriors, the men from Musashi and Sagami and Kazusa, the men who had grown up in the warrior tradition of the Kanto Plain, who had trained for this since childhood, who understood the culture of the fighting man in the same way that people understand the culture they grow up in from the inside without needing it explained. They camped together, they ate together, they talked the talk of men who are waiting for battle, which is a specific kind of talk, the talk that is about everything except what is actually being thought about, the talk that holds the anxiety at a manageable distance through the maintenance of normality. Kojiro was with him, his son, the boy who was there to learn, who was learning, who watched his father the way young warriors watched their fathers and their models, with the specific quality of attention that the student brings to the person who embodies what the student aspires to be. Naozane was aware of this watching. Fathers always are. The awareness shaped his behavior in ways both conscious and not, made him more deliberate in his bearing, more careful about the appearance of confidence, more attentive to the performance of what a warrior was supposed to look like. The smaller engagements before Ichinotani had their own weight. The war was not simply the great battles, it was also the skirmishes, the encounters on the road, the raids on supply lines, the small violent exchanges that accumulated into the texture of the campaign. In these smaller fights, Naozane was exactly what he was supposed to be. He was at the front. He was decisive. He moved toward the danger, rather than away from it. He had killed men before Ichinotani. This is not a dramatic statement. It is a simple fact about a man who had been fighting for 20 years, in a culture where fighting meant killing, where the measure of a warrior's effectiveness was the number of enemies he had removed from the field. He had killed men. He had accumulated the record that the warrior culture valued. He had done what was expected of him and had been recognized for it. He had not, as far as the records suggest, found this troubling. This is worth noting, not as a moral judgment, but as a factual observation about the effect of culture on conscience, about the way that the assumptions of the world we grow up in determine what we find troubling and what we find ordinary. In Naozane's world, killing in battle was ordinary. It was the point. It was what warriors were for. He had not been troubled. The night before Ichinotani, the army camped on the eastern approaches to the Taira position. The fires were lit. The horses were fed. The equipment was checked in the particular way that warriors check equipment. Before a major engagement, the careful attention to every buckle and every edge, that is partly practical and partly ritual, the physical activity that occupies the hands, while the mind does its own private preparation. Naozane checked his armor, he checked his bow, he checked the sword that he had carried through the eastern campaigns and the march west. Kojiro was beside him. The boy was quiet. He was doing his own checking, his own preparation, imitating the movements of the man beside him with the careful attention of someone who is not yet sure enough of himself to be casual about it. Naozane looked at his son. What he thought in that moment is not recorded. The chronicles do not give us the interior lives of minor warriors on the night before battle, but the records give us what happened in the days after, and what happened in the days after allows us to infer something about what was in him. Even then, even before the battle, the thing that was going to change. It was not that he was afraid. He had been afraid before battles, and it had not changed him. It was something else, something about the boy beside him, about the particular vulnerability of a young person who is still becoming what he will be, about the way that love sits inside a man like Naozane, alongside everything else that is in him, the loyalty and the skill and the aggression, and the 20 years of accumulated violence. It sits there, it waits, it does not interfere with the violence until the moment arrives when it can no longer not interfere. That moment was coming. He did not know it yet. He finished checking his sword. He slept. In the morning, he rode toward the beach at Ichinotani. Ichinotani, the name means something like the Valley of Ichino, the place of a local deity, whose name has been attached to this narrow strip of coast since before anyone can remember. It is a specific place. It still exists. You can go there now to the city of Kobe, on the shore of Osakawan, and find the site where the battle was fought in the first month of 1184, and stand on the beach. That narrows to almost nothing between the mountains and the sea, and understand immediately why the Taira chose it, and why the choice was still not enough. The Taira fortifications occupied the beach approach from the western end. They had built walls of logs and stone, the kind of fortification that can be constructed quickly from the materials available in a forested coastal landscape that does not require the engineering of permanent walls, but that serves the immediate purpose of slowing an enemy advance and providing cover for defending archers. The men behind the walls were the warriors of the Taira, the Western fighting men who had been the clan's strength for generations, who fought differently from the Eastern warriors with the different weapons emphasis and the different tactical traditions of a military culture that had developed in different terrain for different purposes. They were good fighters. They were defending their home ground. They had everything. That should have made the defense succeed. The Minamoto attack on the western approach began before dawn. This was standard. The advantage of the dawn attack is the disorientation it produces in a defender who has been sleeping, the way that waking into violence creates a moment of cognitive paralysis that the attacker can exploit. Naozane was in the vanguard. He was not there by assignment, not because someone had placed him at the front of the column. He was there because the front of the column was where men like him went when battle was beginning. The culture required it. His own nature required it. The two requirements were, for him, identical. The assault on the fortifications was brutal. Fortified positions do not fall easily. The men behind the walls had the advantage of cover, the advantage of prepared positions, the advantage of knowing exactly where the attack would come from, and having arranged themselves accordingly. The Minamoto advancing across the beach had the advantage of momentum, of numbers, of the knowledge that Yoshitsune's force was coming over the mountains behind the Taira position at the same moment. But momentum and numbers are cold comfort when you are advancing against arrows across flat ground with nowhere to take cover. Men fell on the beach at Ichinotani, not the great commanders, the minor warriors, the men whose names do not appear in the chronicles, except as numbers, except as the undifferentiated mass of the army that advances and takes the losses that make the advance possible. Naozane advanced. He reached the walls. He fought at the walls. Kojiro was somewhere behind him. The boy was in the battle. The father was in the battle. They were both in it. And then, from behind the Taira position, the sound changed. The chronicles describe a quality of noise that shifted in the middle of the battle, a roar from the wrong direction, the sound of Yoshitsune's force arriving at the top of the cliffs and beginning its impossible descent. The Taira defenders heard it first, before they could see it, before they had any information about what was happening on the cliffs. They heard it, the sound of an army, in a place where an army was not supposed to be. What happened to the Taira at that moment is not simple to describe. It is not simply that they panicked. Panic is too simple a word for what happens to a defending force when it suddenly realizes that the position it has prepared is not the position it is actually in, that the battle it was ready for is not the battle that is happening. Something more fundamental breaks down: the shared understanding of what is happening and what to do. That makes a military force function as a unit rather than as a collection of individuals. The orders stop making sense. The positions stop being relevant. The careful preparations stop being useful. And in the absence of the shared understanding, each man defaults to the most basic calculation available, which is the calculation of survival, the immediate assessment of where safety is and how to reach it. For the Taira at Ichinotani, safety was the sea. They broke for the water. The beach became chaos. Warriors who had been holding their positions a moment before were now running, some still fighting as they ran, some simply running, the discipline of the formation dissolving into the urgency of individual flight. The Minamoto poured over and through the collapsing fortifications. Naozane was through the walls and onto the beach before the full extent of the rout became clear. He was a warrior, in the middle of a victory, a man whose cause was succeeding. In the most direct and immediate way, a man whose training and culture and 20 years of experience all told him what to do next. Pursue, press the advantage, do not allow the enemy to reach safety. He rode down the beach, after a fleeing warrior. The warrior was riding hard. He was almost at the water. The boats were close. Naozane called to him. The call was formal. This is important. It was not a shout. It was not a taunt. It was the specific formal challenge of the Eastern warrior tradition, the declaration of identity that the culture required before one warrior engaged another. It was, in a sense, the recognition of the other person's humanity, the acknowledgement that the man you are about to kill is a man, a person with a name and a lineage, not simply an obstacle to be removed. The culture had this. It built this into the practice of war, precisely because war has a tendency to remove exactly this kind of recognition, to reduce the enemy to nothing but the threat he represents. The formal challenge was the culture's attempt to hold on to something human inside the violence. Naozane called his own name. He called his lineage. He called the name of his lord. He called to the warrior ahead of him to turn and face him. The warrior turned. The warrior who turned was Taira no Atsumori. He was 16 years old. This is the fact that everything else in the story of Kumagai Naozane arranges itself around the fact that was so simple and so overwhelming that it could not be incorporated into the framework that Naozane had been using to make sense of his life, 16 years old. Atsumori was the son of Taira no Tsunemori, the nephew of the great Taira no Kiyomori, a young man of the Heike clan who had grown up in the Heian capital, in the silk and ceremony of the most refined civilization in the world. He was a court warrior, which is to say that he was a man who had been educated in both the martial arts and the aesthetic arts of the Heian tradition, who could fight and also play music, who understood the world of the battlefield and also the world of the poetry contest, who was, in other words, the thing that the Heian court at its best produced, a person of complete cultivation. He played the flute, the yokobue, the transverse flute, of the court music tradition, an instrument that requires years of practice. To play well, that produces a sound unlike any other instrument. In the Japanese musical tradition, a sound that the Heian poets had associated with autumn evenings and the particular emotion of beautiful things that are already ending. He was known for the quality of his playing, in a court where musical ability was one of the primary measures of a person's refinement. He had been noticed. He had been in the Western campaign because he was Taira, because the Taira had been fighting for their survival, and every man of the clan who could be put on horseback had been put on horseback. He was 16 years old. He was not a seasoned warrior. He was a boy who had trained in the way that Taira boys trained, who had the skills appropriate to his rank and his age, who was at Ichinotani because the clan needed him there, and not because he had chosen to be in the middle of a war at 16 years old. The accounts of what happened on the beach are detailed. The Heike Monogatari, the great chronicle of the war, handles this scene with a care that suggests the writers understood they were recording something that was not simply a battle incident, but something more fundamental, a moment that the culture needed to look at directly. Atsumori had been riding for the boats. He had almost reached the water. He was going to escape. When Naozane called to him, he could have kept riding. He could have ignored the challenge. He could have made it to the boats and survived the battle of Ichinotani and gone on to whatever the rest of his life would have been. He turned back. Why he turned back is a question the chronicle does not answer directly. It gives you the action without explaining the intention behind it, but the action itself is the explanation. He was Taira. He was a warrior of the clan He had been raised in the tradition that the formal challenge was binding, that to ignore it was to declare yourself unworthy of being a warrior, that the honor involved in responding to a proper challenge outweighed the practical advantage of running away. He turned back. He charged Naozane. The two men grappled. They pulled each other from their horses. They went down onto the sand of the Ichinotani beach, the eastern warrior in his eastern armor, and the young court warrior in his, and they struggled in the way, that men who are trying to kill each other and trying not to be killed struggle without grace, without ceremony, with everything reduced to the most fundamental question of which body will still be functioning when the struggle is over. Naozane was stronger. He was older. He had 20 years of this, and the boy had none of it, or almost none. The training that could not substitute for the experience. He got the boy down. He pulled off the helmet. He was going to take the head. This was what you did. The head was the proof, the evidence of the kill that you presented to your commanders as the record of your accomplishment. He pulled off the helmet, and the face beneath it was the face of a boy who was the same age as his son. The chronicles give Naozane a moment here, a moment of hesitation, a pause in which he looked at the face, and the face looked back at him, and something in that exchange produced a quality of recognition that the violence had not produced. He had killed men before. He had taken heads before. He had done this many times in the 20 years of his career, but those men had been in the moment of killing the enemy, the abstract opponent, that the clarity of the cause had made them. This was not the abstract opponent. This was a boy who was frightened, a boy who was bleeding, a boy whose face, in the moment of its exposure, had the particular quality of a young face that has just understood what is about to happen to it. Naozane looked at the face. He could not do it. He tried to let him go. The accounts say this clearly. He tried to find a way to spare the boy. He looked around the beach for some configuration of the battle that would allow him to simply stop, to leave this particular opponent alive, to ride away and let the boy reach the boats. But the beach was full of other Minamoto warriors. They were everywhere. There was no configuration in which a wounded Taira warrior on the beach at Ichinotani survived if the man who had him down stood up and walked away. Someone else would take the head. Someone else would do what he was trying not to do. He spoke to the boy. He told him who he was. He told him that he did not want to do this. He told him that he was sorry. These are the words the chronicle gives him, not the formal language of the challenge, the actual words of a man who is doing something he does not want to do, and who needs the person he is doing it to know that. The boy told him his name. He said that he was Tairano Atsumori. He said that Naozane knew what to do. He said it with the particular composure that the Heike attributes to him. Throughout this scene, the composure of a young person who has accepted what is happening and who is choosing to meet it in a way that is consistent with who he is. He was 16 years old. He accepted it. Naozane took the head. He did what the culture required. He did what the battle required. He did what his 20 years of being exactly this kind of man had made him capable of doing, even in the moment when he did not want to do it. He took the head, and as he prepared to carry it away, as he was handling the helmet and the things that had been attached to it, he found something. Tucked inside the helmet, tied to the cord that secured it to the head, was a small flute, the hangdi, the court flute, the instrument of the Heian music tradition. That produced the sound the poets associated with autumn evenings and beautiful things ending. The boy had carried his flute. to the battlefield. He had carried it to the battle at Ichinotani, into the chaos and the violence and the rout, and it had been there. When Naozane found him, inside the helmet, against his head, as if he had wanted to keep it close, Naozane held the flute. He stood on the beach at Ichinotani. The battle was still happening around him. The rout was still completing itself. The Minamoto were still pursuing. The Taira toward the water. He held the flute. He looked at it. He had been a warrior for 20 years. He had never held anything like this. The flute was small. This is worth saying, because the smallness of it is part of what the detail means. In the context of the chronicle, the way that the smallness of an object can carry a weight out of proportion to its physical dimensions. It was not a large instrument. The yokobue of the court music tradition is held horizontally, played with the breath crossing the embouchure hole, rather than entering it directly, and it is small enough to be tucked inside a helmet, close to the head of a boy who wanted it near him. He had wanted it near him. This is the thing that Naozane could not stop thinking about, standing on the beach, with the battle completing itself around him. The boy had brought the flute to battle. The boy had brought beauty into violence. The boy had been, until the moment Naozane caught him, a person who carried music into the worst of circumstances, who did not want to leave it behind, even when leaving it behind would have made practical sense. In the Heike Monogatari, there is a passage that has been read and taught and memorized by Japanese schoolchildren for 800 years. It is the passage in which Naozane, standing over the body of Atsumori, says something that the chronicle presents without commentary, without explanation, without the apparatus of interpretation that lesser works deploy when they want to make sure the reader understands what they are supposed to feel. He says that he has heard music coming from the Taira camp in the nights before the battle. He says that the warriors of the East, the rough men of Musashi and Sagami, had no music in their camps, no instruments, no playing, nothing but the sounds of men preparing for violence, and the Taira camp had music, even in those days, even in the retreat, even in the desperate circumstances of a clan that was losing a war. It could not afford to lose. There had been someone who played the flute in the evenings he had not known until this moment whose flute it was. The present tense of battle has a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, a quality of total absorption that eliminates everything that is not immediately relevant to the problem of survival and the problem of killing. In this present tense, the flute in Naozane's hand was an intrusion. It was something that did not belong in the world that the battle had created, something that came from a different order of things, from the order in which people made music, and played it in the evenings, and carried the instrument they loved, even into the places where love was not supposed to be relevant. The flute forced a question. The question was not philosophical. It did not present itself as a question about the nature of war, or the ethics of killing, or the structures of the culture. That had brought Naozane to this beach. It presented itself as a feeling that something was wrong, not wrong in the sense that he had done something wrong, wrong in the larger sense, the sense in which an entire world can be wrong, in which the arrangements by which people live can be discovered in a single moment to be insufficient, to be missing something essential that only becomes visible when it is already too late. He carried the head back. This is what warriors did. He was a warrior. He carried the head of Atsumori back to where the commanders were assembling, where the results of the battle were being assessed, where the names of the dead were being recorded. He presented the head. He said whose it was. He said the name. Tairano Atsumori. The name was recognized. Atsumori was not an unknown warrior. He was the nephew of Kiyomori, a young man of the clan whose name carried the weight of the family's story. The response to the name had the quality that names of the defeated always have in the aftermath of victory, the complicated mixture of satisfaction and something that is not satisfaction, the acknowledgement that the person who bore the name was a person worth knowing the name of. Yoshitsune, when he heard about the flute, is reported to have said that in all the armies of the West, there was no one who did not weep. This is in the chronicle. It is presented as the response of the general, the man who had designed the battle, and won it, looking at what the battle had contained, and finding in it something that his victory had not prepared him for. The weeping was not for Atsumori specifically, or not only for Atsumori, it was for what Atsumori represented, for the world that the boy had carried inside his helmet, for the music that had been in the Taira camp. On the evenings before the battle, for the civilization, that the war was in the process of ending. The Heike world was a world of extraordinary refinement. The war that was destroying it was being fought on the Minamoto side by men who had not been part of that refinement, who had grown up in the eastern provinces without the poetry and the music and the careful cultivation of aesthetic sensibility that the Heian court had spent centuries developing. They were winning. They were destroying the world they had not been invited into. And Yoshitsune, looking at the flute, understood something about what that meant. Naozane understood something different. Not the civilizational grief, not the large historical feeling of a world ending, something smaller and more immediate. He understood that the boy had been the same age as his son. He understood that his son was alive and Atsumori was dead, and that the difference between them, from the perspective of the beach at Ichinotani, was not merit or guilt, or the relative worth of their respective causes. The difference was that Naozane had caught one of them, and not the other. This is the kind of understanding that cannot be incorporated into the framework of the cause. The cause requires that the enemy be the enemy, that the man on the other side represents something that justifies his removal from the world. The boy with the flute did not represent anything that justified his removal from the world. He was a boy with a flute. He was dead. In the days after Ichinotani, the campaign moved on. There were other battles to prepare for. The Taira had not been destroyed at Ichinotani. They had escaped to their ships. They were still out there, still holding the emperor, still holding the regalia. The war was not over. The commanders assembled their forces. The Minamoto army prepared to pursue. The machinery of the campaign continued to function with the efficiency of a military operation that has just won a significant battle and is moving toward the next one. Naozane was part of this machinery. He rode with the army. He did what warriors did, but something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way that religious conversions are described in the stories with a sudden overwhelming light and the certainty of transformation, slowly, the way that a weight shifts on a scale gradually adding up to a reading that is different from the reading it had before. He had the flute. He kept it. He did not present it with the head. He kept it. The flute of the boy he had killed stayed with him. As the campaign moved west, as the war continued, as the world that both of them had inhabited continued its process of becoming something new. The war ended at Dan Nura, the final naval battle, in the strait between the main island and the southern island, the battle where the tide changed, and the Taira admiral changed sides, and the emperor died in the sea, and the clan that had ruled Japan for a generation ceased to exist as a military force. Naozane was not at Dan Nora. The records place him, in other engagements, at the margins of the final campaign, among the forces that secured the western provinces. As the main naval battle was fought elsewhere, he heard about the outcome, the way most men in the army heard about it, through the transmission of news that moves through a military force. After a decisive engagement, the specific quality of information that is both expected and still somehow surprising, the confirmation of what everyone had believed was inevitable, but that still produces, when confirmed, a quality of stillness. The Taira were finished, the war was over, the Minamoto had won. Victory is a strange state. The literature of war focuses heavily on the battle, on the approach and the engagement, and the immediate aftermath, and then tends to jump to the long-term consequences, to the political settlements, and the historical transformations that the battle made possible. It tends to skip the weeks and months immediately after the battle, when the men who fought it are still the men who fought it, still in the landscape, still with each other, still carrying the weight of what happened, without yet having the distance to understand what it means. Naozane was in this period. The campaign was over. The purpose for which he had come west had been accomplished. The Minamoto cause had prevailed. His loyalty had been vindicated. In the most complete way available, the way of military victory, he had done what he was supposed to do. He had been what he was supposed to be. He had fought well, and served his lord, and represented his family with the kind of distinction that the warrior culture valued. He should have felt what warriors feel after victory. He did not feel it. What he felt instead was the weight of the flute. Not literally, the flute was a small object. It weighed almost nothing, but he had been carrying it since the beach at Ichinotani, carrying it through the rest of the campaign, through the engagements and the marches, and the days of waiting that make up the bulk of any military operation. It had been with him, and it had been asking him a question that he had been unable to answer. The question was not complicated. It was the simplest question available. What was the flute for in the world that the war had made? The Heike world was gone. The court that had produced the boy with the flute, the civilization that had spent centuries developing the kind of person who could play the yokobue, and also fight with a sword, who understood poetry, and also understood tactics, who carried beauty into battle, because beauty was not separate from the rest of life, but woven all through it. That civilization was gone, broken at Dan Nora, its leaders dead or scattered, its center destroyed. The world that was replacing it was the world that Naozane came from, the world of the Eastern warrior, the world of practical violence, organized around loyalty and duty, and the management of land and men. It was a world that did not produce people who carried flutes into battle. He went home. After the campaign ended, after the administrative work of securing the victory was done, the warriors of the East began to return to their provinces, to the lives that the war had interrupted, to the families and the lands. That were the reason. The loyalty to Yoritomo had a material basis, as well as an emotional one. Naozane went back to Musashi. He went back to his compound, to the flat country of the Kanto plain, to the landscape where he had been born and trained and become what he was. Kojiro was with him. His son was alive. The boy who had gone to war at his father's side had come back from the war. This should have been simple joy. The father and the son together, both alive, the cause victorious, the world in the most immediate sense, entirely as it should be. But Naozane was not capable of simple joy in the period after the campaign. He was capable of going through the motions of it, of performing the ordinary satisfactions, of a warrior returned from a successful war. He could not feel them. The compound at Musashi was where he had lived his entire life. He knew every corner of it. He knew the light at every season, the particular way the wind came, off the mountains to the west. In autumn, the sound of the rice harvest, in the paddies that surrounded the compound, the daily rhythms of a landed warrior's life. In the eastern provinces, he had left this and come back to it. He was supposed to be home, but he was not home. Home requires a continuity of self, a connection between the person who left and the person who returned, an identity of the man at the gate with the man who had walked out of it. Naozane had walked out of the compound. A warrior, the man who came back, was also a warrior, the same body, the same skills, the same rank and reputation, and record of service, but something internal had changed, something that did not show on the outside, but that made the familiar landscape feel slightly wrong, slightly off, like a painting where the perspective is almost right, but not quite, where something in the arrangement of distances tells you, without being able to say exactly how, that what you are looking at is not the thing itself. He kept the flute. He did not display it. He did not talk about it, at least not in the records that have survived. He kept it somewhere in the compound, in the space that it occupied, in his possession, the object that did not belong to the world he had come back to, the thing that had come from the other world, the world the war had ended, and that was now here, in the Eastern warrior's compound, asking its question, in the language of its existence. The question had not changed. He still could not answer it. What he was beginning to understand, slowly, in the months after the campaign, was that the inability to answer it was itself the answer, not an answer he had words for yet, but an answer that was taking shape, in the space behind the ordinary movements of his daily life, in the hours before sleep, in the quality of the silence that came over him at particular moments, in the accumulation of small recognitions that were pointing collectively toward something he had not previously been equipped to understand. He was changing. He did not know what he was changing into. He only knew that he could not stay what he had been. The question that Naozane could not answer was not the question he thought it was. He thought it was a question about the boy, about whether what he had done on the beach at Ichinotani was justifiable, whether the cause had been sufficient, whether the logic of war provided adequate cover for the specific act of killing a 16-year-old who had turned back when he could have kept writing. This is the question that the surface of his situation presented. It is also the wrong question, or rather, it is a question that contains a deeper question inside it, the way that the visible part of a problem often contains the real problem at a level beneath the visible. The deeper question was about the framework, not about this particular act, within the warrior framework, about the warrior framework itself. The warrior framework had served Naozane for 40 years. It had given him an identity, a purpose, a set of values, a way of understanding himself. And his place in the world? That was coherent and complete, and supported at every level by the culture he lived in. Within that framework, what he had done at Ichinotani was correct. It was what warriors did. It was what the situation required. The cause was legitimate. The enemy was the enemy. The kill was the kill. But the flute had made a hole in the framework. Not a large hole. A small one. The size of a boy. The size of the sound that a yoko bue makes in the evenings in a camp that is going to be destroyed in the morning. And through that hole, something was visible. that the framework had previously kept out of sight. What was visible was this: the framework that justified the killing also required the killing, not as a contingency, not as a regrettable necessity, that the framework acknowledged while wishing it were otherwise, but as the point, the warrior framework, existed to produce men who killed, and called it virtue. This is not a criticism. Every functional society produces ideological frameworks that convert the behaviors the society needs into virtues, into things that are not merely useful, but good, not merely necessary, but honorable. The warrior society of 12th century Japan needed men who could kill. It built a framework that made killing honorable. It celebrated the men who were best at it. It created systems of recognition and reward that pointed toward killing as the highest expression of the warrior's nature. Naozane had been, by these measures, one of the better products of this framework. But frameworks have limits. They work until they encounter something that falls outside the categories they provide, something that cannot be processed by the existing system of values, something that arrives from outside the framework, and that the framework cannot simply absorb without changing. The flute was that something, not the flute as a physical object, the flute as the evidence of a world that the framework had defined as the enemy, but that was, once you looked at it directly, not simply the enemy. The Heike world was a world that made flutes, and taught boys to play them, and sent those boys to war, carrying the flutes they had practiced with, because they were not entirely warriors, because they were also something else, something that the Eastern warrior framework had no category for. Naozane had destroyed, something he had no category for. The grief, when it came, was not clean. Grief that comes from the loss of someone you loved has a quality of clarity that makes it, in some ways, bearable. You know what you have lost. You know why it hurts. The loss and the pain are aligned, pointing in the same direction. The grief that Naozane felt was not like this. It was confused grief. Grief mixed with something like guilt, and guilt mixed with something like confusion, and confusion mixed with the fundamental disorientation of a man who had been entirely certain of the values that organized his life, and was no longer certain. The warrior culture did not have good tools for this kind of grief. It had tools for the grief of loss, for the warrior who lost his lord, or his companion in arms, or his son. These were recognized forms of suffering that the culture had developed responses to, but the grief of a man who has done everything right and still feels wrong was not a recognized form. The culture did not have a word for it. The culture, in fact, tended to view it with suspicion, as a sign of insufficient commitment to the values that the culture required. Naozane could not talk about this with the men around him. The warriors of Musashi were not men who discussed the philosophical foundations of their vocation. They were men who did the vocation. The vocation was its own justification. The question of whether the justification was sufficient was not a question that the culture had trained them to take seriously. If he had said to one of his companions that he had been unable to stop thinking about the boy with the flute, the response would have been, essentially uncomprehending, "You killed him. He was the enemy. The battle was won. Why are you still thinking about him?" The question behind the question about the framework itself, was not available to them. They were inside the framework. You cannot see the frame from inside the picture. Naozane was, slowly and against his will, moving to a place from which the frame became visible. This is an uncomfortable movement. The person who can see the frame of the values they have lived inside is not simply a more enlightened version of the person who could not see it. They are a different person, with a different relationship to everything they previously believed, a relationship that is more complicated and less comfortable, and requires a kind of ongoing negotiation with the self that the person inside the frame never had to perform. Naozane did not want to be this person. He had been the other person, the man inside the frame, for 40 years. He had been successful at it. He had been honored for it. But the flute had done what it had done. The hole was in the framework, and through the hole, the question was coming, the question that would not stop, and that could not be answered, from inside the framework. And that required for its answer something outside the warrior world entirely. He did not know yet what that something was. He was about to find out. Honen, the name means something like the Dharma of the original nature, the teaching that returns to what is most fundamental in the human relationship with the sacred. He was born in 1133, 8 years before Naozane, in the province of Mimasaka, in the western part of Japan. He was a monk, not simply in the sense of a man who had taken religious vows, which was common enough. In 12th century Japan, where the monasteries were full of men who had entered religious life for reasons that ranged from genuine calling to political convenience, he was a monk in the rarer sense, the sense of a person whose entire existence had been organized around a single overwhelming question, and whose life's work had been the pursuit of an answer. The question that Honen asked was the question that Japanese Buddhism in the 12th century was struggling with. At the level of its deepest institutions, the question was about salvation, not salvation as it is sometimes understood in other religious traditions, the one-time event of being saved by an external power, salvation in the Buddhist sense, which is release from the cycle of suffering, the attainment of the state, in which the distortions of greed and hatred and delusion no longer operate in the condition that the tradition calls nirvana, or the Pure Land, or awakening, depending on which tradition. Within the larger Buddhist world, you are asking, the question was, who could attain this? The traditional answer, in the forms of Buddhism, that had been dominant in Japan for several centuries, was people who practiced, the monks and the nuns, who had renounced the world and devoted their lives to the elaborate practices of the monastic tradition, the meditation and the study, and the ritual and the discipline that the tradition required. Ordinary people, people with lives and families and desires, people who killed things and ate meat and participated fully in the world of ordinary human entanglement, could perhaps accumulate merit through devotion and generosity that would improve their circumstances in the next life. But the full attainment, the liberation from suffering itself, was for the practitioners. Honen did not accept this. He had read everything. He had spent decades in the libraries of the monasteries, reading the entire corpus of the Buddhist canon as it had been preserved and transmitted through the Japanese tradition, and he had found in that reading a teaching that he believed contained a different answer, the teaching of the Pure Land, the teaching of Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite light and infinite life, who had made in the ancient past a vow that anyone who called his name with sincere faith would be received into the Pure Land, the realm of complete peace, where the conditions for liberation were available to everyone, regardless of their capacity for practice, regardless of their position in the social hierarchy, regardless of what they had done. Anyone, not the accomplished practitioner, not the monk with 40 years of meditation, not the aristocrat who could afford to endow temples and commission sutras, anyone who called the name This was a radical teaching in the context of 12th century Japan, not because the teaching itself was new. The Pure Land tradition had been part of Japanese Buddhism. For centuries, there were temples and practices and texts devoted to Amida throughout the country. What was radical was Honin's insistence that this was not one practice among many, not an addition to the existing repertoire of the accomplished practitioner, but the sufficient and complete path, the thing itself, the answer to the question of salvation. That made all the other answers secondary. The Nembutsu, the recitation of the name, Namu Amida Butsu, not a supplement. The path. The established Buddhist institutions in Kyoto and Nara were not pleased. Honin's teaching threatened the entire edifice of institutional Buddhism, the temples and their land holdings, and their political influence and their monopoly on the means of salvation. That made ordinary people dependent on them for the most important transaction in their lives. If anyone could call the name and be received by Amida, then the elaborate apparatus of the established institutions was not simply unnecessary, it was a fraud, a system that had been telling people for centuries that they needed what the institutions had to offer, when in fact what they needed was available to anyone who opened their mouth. Honin was eventually exiled from Kyoto for the radicalism of his teaching. But before that, and after and throughout the decades of his teaching life, he taught, and the people who came to him were often not the people the established institutions served. They were the people who had been told that salvation was not for them. Warriors came to Honin. This is recorded. It is not simply legendary. The teacher who said that anyone could call the name, that the depth of your sin was not an obstacle to the compassion of Amida, that the man of violence was as reachable by the Pure Land's light as the monk of 40 years attracted the attention of men who had been living with violence and who had come to understand that the warrior framework did not by itself provide what they needed. Naozane was one of these men. The exact circumstances of his encounter with Honin are not fully documented. What is documented is the encounter itself, the fact that Naozane, at some point in the years after Ichinotani, sought out the teacher who was saying things that no one else in his world was saying, and sat with him and asked him the question that he had been unable to answer from inside the warrior framework. The question that Naozane brought to Honin is recorded in the tradition. He asked how a man who kills for a living can be saved, not as a philosophical question, as a personal one, as the question of a specific man, sitting in front of a specific teacher, with a specific history, and a specific boy's face that he could not stop seeing. Honin's answer is the answer that changed Naozane's life. He said that the Nembutsu was for exactly such a man, not despite the killing, not with the killing as an obstacle that the Nembutsu could help overcome. He said that the compassion of Amida was specifically directed toward the beings who needed it most, and that the man who was most deeply entangled in the world of violence and suffering was not the man who was furthest from the Pure Land's reach. He was the man the Pure Land was most urgently trying to reach. The light does not avoid the darkness, it moves toward it. Naozane sat with this. He had brought a question that he expected could not be answered, that he had been carrying, because he had no place to put it down. That had been hollowing out the certainty of his warrior identity from the inside. He had been given an answer, not an answer that resolved the killing, that made it retroactively justified, that told him the framework was fine, and the flute was manageable, and the boy's face would stop appearing. if he simply recommitted to the values that had produced the situation, an answer that acknowledged the full weight of what had happened and held it without collapsing under it. He was not a man beyond salvation. He was a man in the range of salvation. He was the kind of man salvation was for. He said the name, Namu Amida Butsu. He kept saying it. Something in him, not the part that was trained to fight, not the part that had been built by 40 years of Eastern warrior culture, but something deeper, something that had been there all along, waiting for the question. That would call it out. Something responded. The decision to leave the warrior life was not made quickly. This is important to understand about Naozane's renunciation, because the stories about religious conversion tend to move too fast, tend to jump from the precipitating event to the transformative moment to the new life, as if the distances between them are shorter than they are. They are not short. The distance between the event on the beach and the day Naozane left his compound was years, and the years were full of the ordinary complications of a man with a life that was not simply his own. He had a wife. Her name is not prominent in the records, which is typical of the period, typical of the way that the chronicles of the warrior world treated the women inside it as presences rather than people, as the context in which the man's story happened, rather than as participants in the story. But she was there. She had been there throughout the campaign. She had managed the compound at Musashi. While Naozane was in the west, she and the household staff, keeping the operation running, the rice paddies managed, the accounts maintained, the local relationships that sustained the family's position, attended to. She was a warrior's wife. She understood the warrior life. From the inside, she understood its demands and its rhythms and the particular quality of presence that a warrior husband offered, which was sometimes fully present and sometimes entirely absent, and which required a kind of independence and self-sufficiency that not every person could sustain. She had sustained it. The conversation between a husband who is contemplating radical renunciation and the wife whose life will be most immediately affected by it is one that the warrior chronicles do not tend to record in detail. The chronicles are interested in the man's spiritual journey. The wife's experience of that journey is noted, when it is noted at all, as a backdrop, as the human cost that the spiritual journey requires, and that the spiritual journey is understood to justify. What we can infer is that there was a conversation. There were probably many conversations. The decision to leave a warrior household, to give up the rank and land and position, to step away from everything, that supported not just the man, but the family, was not a decision that could be made in isolation, not a decision that affected only the person making it. It affected everyone. Kojiro was there too, the son who had ridden west with his father, the young man who had watched Naozane in the campaign, and had been learning through that watching what a warrior was. The son was now the man who would take over. If Naozane left, Kojiro was the head of the family. The responsibility that the father was setting down was the responsibility the son would pick up. This was not, in the warrior culture, unusual. Succession was understood. The son taking over from the father was the normal transition of the warrior household. What was unusual was the reason for the transition. Not death, not incapacity, but renunciation. A father choosing to leave. What he had built, what the son had grown up in, what the family was, because the father could no longer be what the family required him to be. Naozane sent the flute to Atsumori's family. This is documented. He had the flute delivered through whatever intermediary was available to the surviving members of the Taira clan, to the people who would have known whose flute it was and what the name attached to it meant. The delivering of the flute was a gesture of the kind that gestures can be when language is insufficient, when the thing you need to communicate is too large, or too complicated, or too compromised by the circumstances to be communicated in words. He was giving back what he had taken, not the life. The life could not be given back, but the object that had stood for the life, the thing that Atsumori had carried into the last morning of his existence, the small wooden flute that had music in it, even when its owner was dead. He sent it back, and along with the flute, according to some versions of the account, he sent a poem. The poem addressed Atsumori, as if speaking to the dead, the convention of the memorial poem. In the Japanese tradition, the poem that says what cannot be said in the presence of the living. To the person who is gone, the poem was not absolution. The poem was not an apology, exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a naming of what had happened, in the language that Atsumori's world had valued, the language of poetry, the language of the court, the language that was not the language of the beach. At Ichinotani, he cut his hair. In the Japanese tradition, the cutting of the hair is the physical act that marks the transition from the secular life to the religious life, the gesture that is simultaneously the declaration of the decision and the beginning of the new state. You are different now. The hair that marked your secular identity is gone. The person it belonged to is, in the most meaningful sense, also gone. He cut his hair, he took the vows, he received the monk's name, that replaced the warrior name, that had been his identity. For 40 years, his monk name was Rensei, the lotus clarity, the name that the religious tradition gives to the person who has chosen to organize their life around the pursuit of liberation rather than the pursuit of victory. He walked out of the compound at Musashi. The accounts do not dwell on the moment of leaving. They are more interested in what came after, in the life of practice that the renunciation opened. But the moment of leaving was real. It was the compound he had grown up in, the landscape of the Musashi plain, the flat country and the rice paddies, and the mountains to the west, his wife, his son, the life he had built over 40 years of being exactly what his world had required him to be. He left it. He walked away from it, into the uncertainty of the religious life, the life that had no compound and no rank and no record of accomplishment. In the terms that the warrior world valued, the life organized around a name, the name of Amida, Namu Amida Butsu. The question that had brought him here was not answered by the leaving. This is another thing, that the stories of religious conversion tend to obscure the fact that renunciation is a beginning, not a resolution, that the person who walks out of their old life does not walk into clarity. They walk into practice, into the daily work of building a different relationship with the question. That drove them to leave. The boy's face was still there. It did not stop being there. Because Naozane had cut his hair, the killing was still real. It did not become unreal because he had taken the vows. What changed was not the past. The past is not available for changing. What changed was what he was doing with it, what direction he was pointing, the weight of what had happened, whether he was using it to drive himself deeper into the silence of the warrior identity, or whether he was using it, as Honen had suggested it could be used, as the beginning of the path, as the reason for the prayer, as the weight that made the Nembutsu not a comfortable practice, but a necessary one. He walked. He prayed. He kept walking. The practice of the Nembutsu is simpler than it sounds. You say the name, Namu Amida Butsu. You say it again. You keep saying it. This is, on the surface, almost embarrassingly simple. The religions that emphasize complexity, the elaborate philosophical frameworks, and the intricate ritual systems, and the years of study required to understand the basics of the doctrine have always looked at the Nembutsu with a kind of intellectual suspicion, as if the simplicity itself were a disqualification. If it is this simple, surely it cannot be this important. If anyone can do it, what is the value of those who have dedicated their lives to the harder path? These are the objections that Honen's teaching faced. Honen's answer was consistent. The simplicity is the point. The accessibility is the point. The fact that it is available to everyone, including the person, who has no capacity for complexity, including the person, whose life has been organized around violence, and who cannot read the sutras, and who will never spend 40 years in meditation, is not a failure of the teaching. It is the teaching. Rensei, which is how Naozane is known, after his renunciation, practiced the Nembutsu. He practiced it the way that Honen had described it should be practiced, which was constantly, repeatedly, as many times as possible, the name filling the space. Where the thoughts of the warrior had previously been, the deliberate redirection of attention, away from the world of strategy and violence, and toward the single point of the name, Namu Amida Butsu, in the morning, in the evenings, in the hours of walking that the wandering religious life required. He walked. This is documented. Rensei walked. The life of the wandering monk in medieval Japan was a life of movement, of pilgrimage, of the continuous journey between the temples and the holy places. That structured the religious landscape of the country. He moved through it. He was a large man, presumably, a warrior who had spent 40 years. In the physical life, who carried in his body the accumulation of decades of training, walking with a staff, through the landscape of a country that was organizing itself around the new military government at Kamakura. The praying for Atsumori was explicit. Rensei kept specific memorial practices for the boy he had killed. This is unusual in the records of the period, not because men did not pray for the enemies they had killed, but because the records rarely preserved the details of this practice, the private devotions, that did not produce the kinds of outcomes that the chronicles valued. What the records show is that Rensei understood his practice as specifically connected to Atsumori, that the Nembutsu was not, for him, a general practice divorced from particular history, but a practice rooted in particular history, in the specific face of the specific boy, on the specific beach, in the flute, in the music, that the boy had carried into the last morning of his life. He was praying for Atsumori every day. He was using the practice that Honen had given him as the vehicle for the one thing he had most needed to do since the beach at Ichinotani, and had not had the form to do. He was trying to carry the boy to the Pure Land. There is a theological difficulty with this intention that Rensei probably understood, and that the Pure Land tradition had various ways of addressing. The difficulty is this: the Nembutsu is a practice for the person saying it. It is the expression of the practitioner's own faith, the calling of the name, by the person who needs the calling, directed toward their own liberation. It is not, in the strict doctrine, a transferable practice. You cannot say the name on behalf of someone else. The name must be said by the person who needs it. Atsumori was dead. He could not say the name. But the tradition had found ways to hold the tension between the doctrinal limits and the human need. to do something for the dead. The memorial practice, the praying for the spirit of the deceased, was not understood as transferring the merit of the Nembutsu directly to the dead person. It was understood as an expression of the compassion that Amida extends to all beings, including the dead, including the beings who had not had the opportunity in their lifetime to hear the teaching or say the name. The compassion does not require that the being know about it in order to operate. The Pure Land's light reaches in all directions. Rensei could not save Atsumori. He could not undo the beach. He could not return the boy to the life the beach had ended, but he could hold the memory of Atsumori. In the practice, it could carry that specific face and that specific flute into the space of the Nembutsu, could say the name, for a boy who could no longer say it for himself. This was what he did. This was the vow that shaped the practice. The world continued to change around him. Yoritomo established the Kamakura government. The political structure of Japan shifted away from the ancient capital and toward the eastern city. The warrior culture that Naozane had come from became, under Yoritomo's management, the dominant culture of the country, the framework within which all subsequent Japanese history would operate for the next several centuries. Rensei walked through this changing world as a monk walks through the world with a specific kind of detachment. That is not indifference, but something more like the attention that does not grasp. He was in the world. He observed it. He prayed in it. He did not try to hold what was passing. The Eastern warrior culture that had shaped him was being institutionalized. The values he had lived by were being codified into the administrative framework of the new order. He had left that culture. He watched it become permanent. From the outside, there is something in this that the Heike tradition does not miss. The man who had fought for the victory that made the new order possible had walked away from the new order. At the moment of its birth, had been transformed by the victory into something the victory did not produce. He kept walking. He kept saying the name Namu Amida Butsu, the name in the morning, the name in the evening, the name on the road, between one temple and the next, the name in the particular quality of attention that the warrior had applied to the battlefield, and that the monk now applied to the single syllables of the ancient invocation. He was not the same person who had ridden west 20 years before. He was not trying to be. He was Rensei, the lotus clarity, the man who had found at the end of the warrior life the beginning of a different one. There is a paradox at the center of Rensei's story that the Heike Monogatari does not resolve and does not try to resolve. The paradox is this: the man who killed Atsumori became the man who prayed for Atsumori. The act of killing produced the act of praying. The violence produced the devotion. The worst thing he had done became the source of the most important thing he did. This is not a comfortable paradox. It does not resolve in any direction. That leaves everyone satisfied if the killing was necessary, because the cause was just. Then the grief that followed from it seems excessive, seems like a failure of nerve, seems like the reaction of a man who was not fully committed to the values he claimed to hold. If the killing was wrong because the boy was innocent, then the entire prior life, the 20 years of loyal service, the campaign, the cause, everything that brought Naozane to the beach was complicit in the wrong. The paradox refuses both resolutions. It holds them in tension, and insists that you hold them in tension too. The Japanese literary and religious tradition is unusually comfortable with paradox. This is not a coincidence. The specific traditions that shaped The culture in which the Heike was written, the Buddhist understanding of impermanence, and the aesthetic philosophy of mono no aware, the pathos of things, had both developed, over centuries of careful thought, a way of holding the irresolvable tensions of existence without needing to resolve them. The cherry blossom is beautiful because it falls. The warrior is noble because he dies. The civilization is precious because it is temporary. The beauty and the loss are not opposites, they are aspects of the same thing. The falling is not the negation of the beauty, it is the completion of it. Rensei's story fits this logic without forcing it. The killing and the praying are not opposites in the Heike's handling of them. They are aspects of the same person, the same life lived in its full complexity, the full arc of a man, who was capable of both and who became the one because of the other. The praying does not redeem the killing. The Heike is too honest for that. It does not suggest that the grief and the renunciation and the decades of Nembutsu balance the account, that the moral ledger was set right by the practice. The killing happened. It cannot be made unhappened. Atsumori's face cannot be unremembered. The beach at Ichinotani cannot be unvisited. But the praying is real too. The decades of wandering and practice and the specific memorial devotion are as real as the act that preceded them. The Heike holds both. It does not adjudicate between them. The paradox extends to the relationship between Rensei and Atsumori after the killing. In the Pure Land Buddhist tradition, the relationship between the living and the dead is not simply severed by death. The practice of Nembutsu creates a connection, however mediated, however uncertain in its metaphysical status, between the person saying the name and the persons being held in mind. While it is said, Rensei held Atsumori in mind every day for decades. He knew things about Atsumori that Atsumori's friends and family might not have known. He knew the weight of the helmet. He knew the quality of the silence in the moment after the helmet came off. He knew the specific shade of the boy's face in the specific light of that specific morning on the beach. He knew these things because he had been there, because the intimacy of killing is a particular intimacy, unwished for and unshared, the specific knowledge that can only be acquired by being the person who was there. The Heike gives Atsumori the last word in the literary tradition that grew up around the story in the no play called Atsumori that would be written 2 centuries later. The dead boy returns as a spirit and completes the conversation. That was not finished on the beach. He does not come in anger. He does not come to accuse. He comes to release. He comes to tell Rensei that the prayer has reached him, that the connection, established in violence, has been transformed by the practice into something that can receive the compassion it was pointed toward. The no play is later. It is not the Heike, but it is a response to the Heike, a completion that the tradition felt was necessary, the working out over centuries of the implications, of the paradox that the Heike had been honest enough to leave unresolved. What the Heike gives us is something rarer than resolution. It gives us the full picture. Not the warrior who was purely justified, not the monk who was purely transformed, not the killing that was purely necessary or purely wrong, a man, a full man, a man who contained the violence and the grief and the question and the practice and the decades of walking and the name said every morning in the memory of a boy who had turned back when he could have kept writing. The Heike knows that the measure of a story is not whether it ends well, it is whether it ends honestly. This story ends honestly. Rensei lived for many years after his renunciation. The records are not precise about the end of his life. The chronicles that track the warriors of the Genpei War had moved on to other subjects by the time a wandering monk named Rensei was completing his decades of practice. In the temples and on the roads of medieval Japan, he appears in records intermittently, in the accounts of Honin's community, in the registers of certain temples that he passed through, or stayed in for periods of time. He was known, not famous, not in the way that Yoshitsune or Yoritomo were famous, but known in the specific way that the religious communities of the period knew their notable members as a man of practice, as a man whose devotion was genuine, and whose story was understood to contain something important about the relationship between violence and salvation. The story traveled. This is one of the remarkable things about the account of Naozane and Atsumori, the way that it moved through the culture. In the years and decades after Ichinotani, the way that it attached itself to the imagination of the people who heard it and told it and retold it. The Genpei War produced many stories. It produced the full arc of the Heike narrative, the rise and fall of the Taira, the great battles, the deaths of the great commanders, the survival of Kenrei Moin, but the story of Naozane and Atsumori had a particular staying power that the other stories did not all have. It traveled because it was true, in a way that went beyond its factual accuracy. It was true to something about the experience of war that most war stories either ignore or sentimentalize. The experience of proximity, the experience of getting close enough to the enemy to see their face, the experience of discovering in that face the mirror that the cause had told you was not there. The Nao theater of the 14th and 15th centuries returned to the story repeatedly. Zeami Motokyo, the great master of No theater, wrote the play called Atsumori, that placed the dead boy and the living monk in dialogue across the boundary of death. In the play, Rensei encounters a young man cutting grass near Ichinotani. He does not recognize him immediately. He sees the boy, he speaks to him, the conversation deepens, and gradually, in the way of No, in the dreamlike way, that the theater moves between the present and the past, between the living world and the world of the dead. The young man reveals himself. He is Atsumori, or he is Atsumori's spirit, or he is the memory of Atsumori that Rensei has been carrying for decades, taking form in the specific landscape of the place where the meeting happened. The play asks a question that the Heike had posed and left open. What does Atsumori think of Rensei? In the Heike, we have Rensei's response to the killing. We have the grief and the renunciation and the practice. We have the man's side of the story. In the play, Atsumori speaks. He does not speak in anger. This is the crucial thing about Zeami's handling of the scene, the choice that the playwright made, about what the dead boy's spirit would bring to the encounter. He brings not the accusation, but the acknowledgement. He acknowledges that the killing happened. He acknowledges that he was the one who was killed. He acknowledges the specific circumstances, the beach, the helmet, the flute, and then he says something that the tradition understood as release. He says that enemy and friend, in the light of the Pure Land, are not different categories. He says that the enmity of the battlefield was a condition of the world, not a condition of the spirit. He says that Rensei's prayer has reached him, and he dances. The No dance is the culmination of the form. The entire preceding dialogue, the masked face and the measured speech, and the gradual revelation of identity exists to produce the conditions in which the dance can happen, in which the body of the performer can express what the words cannot, in which the specific quality of the movement carries the weight of what the story has accumulated. Atsumori dances. He dances the dance of a warrior. He dances the movements of battle, the drawing of the bow, the turning of the horse, the gestures that belong to the life. He had only begun to live before the beach at Ichinotani, and within the dance of the warrior, there is the sound of the flute, not played, present, the way that something that has been lost is present in the place where it was last held. The dance ends. Atsumori's spirit departs. Rensei is left in the landscape. He says the name, Namu Amida Butsu. The legacy of Naozane and Atsumori extends beyond the no play. The story became part of the permanent furniture of Japanese cultural imagination, the shorthand for a specific kind of encounter that the Japanese tradition values and recognizes and returns to, the encounter between enemies, who discover in the moment of their enmity that they are not only enemies, the encounter between the world of violence and the world of beauty, in which neither world wins, and both worlds are changed by the contact, the encounter between the living and the dead, in which the living carry the dead with them, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, the responsibility to remember accurately, to hold the specific face in the specific light, to not let the abstraction of the cause consume the reality of the person. Kumagai Naozane died as Rensei, the monk, the wanderer, the man of the Nembutsu. The exact date and place are not firmly established in the records. What is established is the story, not the dates, not the administrative details, not the facts that the chronicles valued. The story of a warrior who got close enough to the enemy to see his face, who found in that face something the warrior framework could not process, who spent the rest of his life trying to process it in the only way available to him, the story of a boy with a flute who turned back when he could have kept writing both stories together. The sound of the flute carries. This is a physical fact. The yokobue, the transverse flute, of the court music tradition produces a sound that moves through space with a particular quality, clear and penetrating, and somehow also soft, the kind of sound that you hear from a distance before you understand where it is coming from, the kind of sound that arrives before the source. In the nights before Ichinotani, someone in the Taira camp played the flute. The warriors of the eastern camp, the rough men of Musashi and Sagami, heard it. They heard it across the water or across the open ground. Between the camps, the music coming from the wrong direction, from the place where the people they were going to fight were doing what people do. In the hours before everything changes, the sound of a flute, a boy playing music, because music was part of who he was, and the war had not yet made him entirely a warrior. Naozane heard it. He did not know whose it was. He heard the music coming from the Heike camp and noted it in the way that a warrior notes things that are not tactically relevant, which is to say with a part of himself that was not the warrior, the part that existed beneath the warrior, and that heard music, even when the warrior was trying not to hear anything but the information relevant to survival. He heard it. He did not think about it. He had other things to think about. The battle was coming. He slept. He woke. He rode. And on the beach at Ichinotani, he found out whose flute it was. The flute is the thread that runs through this story and holds it together. Not the sword, not the armor, not the horse, or the bow, or any of the objects that the warrior culture had made central to its self-understanding. The flute the object that did not belong. In the warrior world that had come from the court world, that was the physical evidence of a cultivation, that the war was in the process of destroying. The flute was inside the helmet was on the head of a boy riding away from a lost battle. The boy turned back. This is the center of the story, not the battle, not even the killing. The turning back, the moment when Atsumori, who had almost escaped, who was almost safe, who could have ridden into the sea and reached the boats and survived Ichinotani, to fight at Yashima and Danura, and possibly to survive the war, turned back to face the challenge. Why he turned back is not the interesting question. The interesting question is what it means that the Heike chose to tell us. That he turned back, that the story preserves this detail, that 800 years of readers have been given this detail as the thing they need to know in order to understand the story. He turned back because that was who he was, not because the rules required it, though the rules required it, not because his training demanded it, though his training demanded it, because Atsumori was the kind of person who turned back when called, who responded to the formal challenge, even when responding meant dying, who was 16 years old and had been trained in the warrior tradition and took that training seriously, enough to follow it into the worst possible outcome, who had the flute inside the helmet, who had brought beauty into battle, who was, until the last second of his existence, both things at once, the warrior and the musician, the fighter and the player, the boy who was becoming something complete and did not get the chance. Naozane spent the rest of his life becoming something complete too, not the same thing. He was not Atsumori. He was the Eastern warrior, the man of the Kanto plain, the rough product of the rough Eastern tradition. He became something that the Eastern warrior tradition did not have a category for. A man of practice, a man who had found in the failure of the warrior framework the beginning of a different framework, not a perfect one, not a framework without its own limitations, but one that could hold what the warrior framework could not hold: the face of the enemy, the music in the helmet, the question without an answer. That keeps producing, in people who hold it honestly, a quality of attention. To the world, that is different from the attention of people who have answered it. The beach at Ichinotani is a specific place. You can go there. The landscape has changed, as all landscapes change. Over 800 years, the city of Kobe has grown up around the site. The beach is smaller than it was. The mountains are still there. The sea is still there. In the evenings, the light comes off the water in a way that is not so different from the way it came off the water in the first month of 1184. The light does not know what happened here. It falls where it falls. It illuminates what it illuminates, but the story knows, and the story has been told continuously for 800 years, passed from generation to generation, of Japanese people who found in it something worth preserving, something that the experience of war, and the experience of grief, and the experience of the question, that cannot be answered. From inside the framework, that produced the question, something that all of this needed to say. Atsumori's flute was returned to his family. It passed through hands over the centuries. Where it is now, whether it still exists, whether the physical object has survived the 800 years that have passed since the beach at Ichinotani, is not known, but the music is still playing. Not literally, in the sense that matters, in the sense in which a story continues to produce its effects long after the events it describes are finished. Every time the no play is performed, the dance happens, and within the dance of the warrior, the flute is present. the sound that the Eastern warriors heard. In the nights before the battle, the music that came from the wrong camp, the wrong direction, the sound that arrived. Before its source, every time the Heike is recited, the part about the beach is reached, and the blind monks who preserved this story for centuries after the people who made it are gone, the monks with their Baiwa lutes who traveled the country, singing the Heike to whoever would listen, reach the moment of the challenge, and the turning, and the helmet coming off, and Atsumori's face is there, young, in the specific light of that morning, the same age as the warrior's son. The name was said for him, every day, for decades, in the mouth of the man who had been at the beach in the simple practice that Honin had given him in the accumulation of the days. That made up the rest of Rensei's life. Namu Amida Butsu, the name that holds everything, that cannot otherwise be held, the name that the Pure Land tradition says is sufficient, that the compassion it calls is large enough for everything it is asked to hold. The warrior who could not forget kept remembering, and in the remembering something was preserved that the war had tried to destroy. Not the boy was gone. Something else, the specific weight of the specific face, in the specific light, the knowledge that the enemy had a flute, the knowledge that beauty had been present, in the worst of circumstances, not despite the circumstances, but inside them, carried into them, tucked against the head, of a boy who was not willing to leave it behind. He was not willing to leave it behind. Rensei remembered this. He remembered it every day. He was still remembering it. When the days ended, the flute is still playing,